He's a mystic and a theologian all rolled in one, and in both Christian thought and in Christian practice, he is arguably the gold standard by which every Christian missionary, theologian, and mystic is judged. And without St. Paul, Christian theology wouldn't even be poor, it would be bereft. Within the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to give a brief, and unfortunately a too brief, if not a too brief account of Paul's mystical vision. It is a vision that not only motivated him through thick and thin of his life, but also poured the foundation for Christian theology and life for nearly all of history. I would also like to give an example of Paul's other side, in which mysticism seemingly plays no role. And to do so, I would like to refer to his correspondence, particularly in 2 Corinthians, specifically chapters 11 and 12. I have selected this section, because I believe it well exhibits what I call Paul's two halves. So on to the two halves. There are at least two very visible sides to Paul's personality. There is first, Paul, the mystic theologian and saint, and there is second, Paul, perhaps the urbane, but certainly petulant, first-century Jewish man. Once we hold up both of these halves in relief, we can get a good idea of the complexity, a complexity that on the one hand reveals a sublime theologian, and on the other hand exemplifies what to many seems an annoying crank. To understand his writings, we have to understand both Paul's. So, Paul, the theologian and mystic. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 1 through 5, Paul describes a personal experience. It is necessary to boast. Nothing is to be gained by it, but I will go on to visions and revelations of the Lord. I know a person in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know such a person, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. Was caught up into paradise and heard things that are not to be told, that no mortal is permitted to repeat. On behalf of such a one I will boast. But on my own behalf, I will not boast, except of my weakness. Exegetes are unsure of Paul's reference here. The bulk of opinion is that he is alluding to his conversion, which Luke describes in Acts 9, verses 3 through 8, and also in Acts 26, verses 13 through 18. Though some others will posit that Paul, with this Corinthian passage, is describing another event in his life. Really, that doesn't make too much of a difference. It's no matter. Because undisputed is that Paul is relating some kind of experience of Christ's presence. These days, we would probably consider such a thing as an out-of-body experience. And that's perhaps even too weak a description. If so, Paul's version of this spiritual state transcends any of the accounts seen in much of the popular literature, that is today's literature, and if we hold to such a theory that Paul is referencing his conversion as laid out by Luke and Acts, the encounter on the road to Damascus leaves Saul, then Saul, blind and speechless. The interesting thing about Paul's boast in 2 Corinthians is that there is no traceable line extending from his experience to any subsequent action or development on Paul's part. I cannot give it full justice here this evening, so I hope you will forgive me if I restrict my comments to a couple of sections from what is the epitome of Pauline thought and mysticism. So the first selection then comes from Romans 8, verses 14 through 18. For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received a spirit of adoption. When we cried, Abba, Father, It is that very Spirit bearing witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ, if in fact we suffer with him so that we may also be glorified with him. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. Now I'm emphasizing those verses, and just let me unpack them a bit. Paul here is, this idea of co-heirs. Paul is very, very intent on placing the human, the redemption. The redemption is front and center, and he places this human life within the life that has been remade, the existence that has been remade in Christ, and we come by Christ's resurrection, and we come to share in it. So when Paul starts talking about what we suffer now in Christ is nothing compared to the glory, he sees it as one continuum. He sees this life as one continuum. We're in a little rough spot perhaps now, but don't lose sight of what's coming up. And we may even have experience of what's coming up now, even now. So now in hearing the last line, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory about to be revealed to us. I think Paul's list of suffering in the mission fields. Paul sees everything he endured as part of his life in Christ. In other words, the faith and hope he holds from his vision become a present reality as he endures his suffering. It is more than a vision. The experience becomes existence itself. So there's like an ontological, Paul would make the point that with Christ's resurrection, we are all ontologically changed, and therefore he himself, being an heir of Christ, is ontologically changed, and he got a foretaste, or a bit of a hint, what that new ontology means in his, that experience he describes in Corinthians 12, that third heaven. So then continuing on to the next piece in Romans, verses 19 through 21. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. For the creation was subject to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in the hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We tend to see our human selves as the only part of creation that is worth anything in the divine plan. Or more accurately, salvation is limited to the human dimension. And we do not much think of what God may have in store for what is outside the human person. And Paul challenges that thought. Here, Paul goes beyond humankind, in his vision of salvation. Through the incarnation, Christ sanctifies the whole universe. As Paul goes on to explain, we humans may very well be the first fruits of creation, that's verse 23, but the rest of creation is coming right up behind us. He mentions that in verse 22. For Paul, the promises of redemption not only stretch out to every living thing from human beings, but also includes pets, perhaps insects, plants, and includes the whole inanimate world itself. That somehow the world we live in and what we experience, this too has some kind of redemption that Paul's hinting at, or he may even stating. These verses become the foundation for the great Jesuit paleontologist and theologian Pierre Terre de Chardin, who wrote about it in The Divine Milieu in the middle of the 20th century. And Vatican nearly silenced him for it. Yet, today, as theologians work with the findings of evolutionary biology, it is Romans 8 which supplies much of the material for exploration. We could continue this discussion on Paul the Mystic, but the clock demands that we have to switch to Paul the Urbane, a petulant first-century Jewish man. And actually, I mean, the whole Romans 8, I wish we had the opportunity to go through the whole thing piece by piece, because it really is a beautiful piece, but we don't have the opportunity. Now, Paul, the first century Jewish man. The beautiful description in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 that Paul gives us about being transported into the third heaven is preceded by an exceedingly sarcastic tirade in which he excoriates the Corinthians for listening to the proponents of the circumcision party. Briefly, this is the group in the early church which insisted that Gentiles had to become Jews first in order to become a follower of Christ. That is, they had to keep all the dietary laws, and if male, they had to be circumcised. Paul, on the other hand, argued forcefully that baptism was all that was necessary, and he conducted his missionary activity accordingly. The issue became the first great dispute in the early church. The Judaizers, as the Jewish party came to be called, constantly attacked Paul's credentials, for Paul was not one of the original apostles. And this gives us a really interesting insight into the early church. It seems that these Judaizers, these were the first followers of Christ coming from Palestine. And we know from the history of the church and also from the early Christian writings, these early Christians were actually a Jewish sect. They would go on Saturdays, they would go to the synagogue, and then they would have a Eucharistic meal later on in the day. So it was all part of the Judaism. Paul challenges that, and he sees Christ going beyond Judaism, and he starts going to the Gentiles. And this becomes the big question. Well, you can't become a Christian unless you become a Jew first. And Paul against that, and every time he went on one of these missionary, and this is why, when you're reading the Acts of the Apostles, it gets so, there's so much arguing going on. Every time he would go to a place like, Colossae, or Derbe, or Pergamum, or something like that, the Judaizers would be right on his tail, like 2 days later, and say, don't listen to him, this is the way it's got to be. And then they go running to Paul and say, well, they told us this, and they said, anyway, who are you? You're just a parvenu, a newcomer to this whole thing. And this gets Paul really angry. And so he has a whole body of vitriol that he spits out at them. And this comes right here, actually, in chapter 11. And what I do, I will continue to do in order to deny an opportunity to those who want an opportunity to be recognized as our equals in what they boast about. For such boasters are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder. Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. So it is not so strange if his ministers, who disguise themselves as ministers of righteousness, their end will match their deeds. The battle Paul is fighting is a real one, and his insistence on baptism made Christianity a world religion instead of a Jewish sect. So in the end, Paul comes out on top. As the Judaizers would have had it, becoming a sect of Judaism, these Judaizers boast of their lineage as people who knew Christ personally. Paul does not buy it. They may think their boasting will carry the day, meaning I know Jesus personally, but it doesn't. They may have met the person of Jesus, but Paul demonstrates they don't understand his significance. Because they do not understand his significance, they are false apostles and deceitful workers. Since Satan is the master of deceit, the Judaizers are following his example. Their end will match their deeds equals they can go to hell. Paul continues by switching to a very sarcastic and mocking tone. I repeat, let no one think that I am a fool, but if you do, then accept me as a fool so that I may boast a little. What I am saying in regard to this boastful confidence, I am saying not with the Lord's authority, but as a fool. Since many boast according to human standards, I will also boast. For you gladly put up with fools, being wise yourselves. For you put up with them when someone makes you For you put up with it when someone makes slaves of you, or preys upon you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or gives you a slap in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool. I also dare to boast of that. The language is very interesting. First, Paul specifically states that what he is saying should not in any way be associated with his gospel message. I am saying not with the Lord's authority, but as a fool. He does this also in other places throughout the Corinthian correspondence. He's very sure to distinguish where he is speaking as a man, as a person who's kind of angry or whatever it is, and what he considers to be divine inspiration. He always makes that distinction in various places. So anyway, he says, I am saying not with the Lord's authority, but as a fool. As I go in, now what I'm going to do here, I'd like to just again get the power of what he's saying here. This is not a translation that I'm giving you, but it is a bit of a translation. I'm going to recite this passage that I just read, but I'm going to try and put it into a contemporary American speech, more of a tonal translation than perhaps a literary one. Okay, but it would go something like this. Since they use human standards to justify their boasting, I will too. I'm sure you won't have a problem with that, for you pride yourselves in being so open-minded and wise that you will listen to any fool who speaks. After all, you seem to like it when others arrogantly come waltzing in, seek you out, and get you to jump at their beck and call, or fleece you, or slap you in the face for not being fast enough. Yes, you are very wise to follow them. I must really apologize to you for not being so strong in my convictions to do that. But if you are going to listen to human boasts, I guess I'll have to bring myself down to their level and boast too. And then Paul lets loose with everything he can boast about. Are they ministers of Christ? I'm talking like a madman. I am a better one, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless floggings, and often near death. 5 times I have received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I received a stoning. 3 times I was shipwrecked. For a night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from bandits, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers and sisters, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, hungry and thirsty, often without food, cold and naked. And he's right. That's exactly what he went through. Now, then, after that point, he gives the rendition of that mystical vision about being caught up in the third heavens. From this very short presentation, we can see the real complexity of Paul's character. He has this mystical vision which reshapes and remakes the categories by which he defines reality, specifically the ineffable third heaven. And we can see this new reality wonderfully described in Romans 8. So yes, he is living in the next world. The mystical vision, the mystical Paul. Simultaneously, when he is working in this world to get people to listen to what he says about the next, the kid gloves come off, and he can be cantankerous, sarcastic, and belittling. This kind of complexity surfaces in other points of the whole Pauline correspondence as well. Particularly, and this is when perhaps Paul's real, Paul's real sore point, when he starts to micromanage a situation, as he does in 1 Corinthians 11, 4 through 16, when he desperately tries to regulate women's and men's hairstyles and then gives up. Conclusion. The important part in reading and interpreting St. Paul is to realize that he, like us, is very complex and has all the inner conflicts we do. In interpreting his writings, it is necessary to determine which Paul to really listen to and from whom to take heart. Yet, at the end of the day, St. Paul, like us in all his complexity, is only one person, and the struggle in his life, as it is with our individual lives, is to bring those two halves together so that the best parts of both hone down all the bumpy parts that cannot contribute to the life in Christ, to union in Christ, with Christ. The ability and the desire to let God's grace do so is a lifelong project. Paul's mysticism lies in letting the life promised in the next world convert the work in this world to its purpose. And really, that is the Christian view too.
thank you very much all for coming, and I would say for staying tonight. First of all, I want to express my gratitude for the fact that I have got from the Institute the opportunity to spend 4 amazing months in a very creative and stimulating environment of the St. John's University, and the opportunity to meet great people. I would like to thank to my fellows from the Collegial Institute for every kind of support and help whenever I need it. My deep appreciation goes to the monastic community for friendship, prayer, simplicity I've experienced during my stay here. And a special acknowledgement of gratitude must be given to John and Linda Heschler from St. Paul for their support and friendship. I met them last year in Slovakia, and also thanks to them, my visit here has been made possible. In regard to the structure of the presentation, it is simple. I have divided my talk into 2 parts. In the first part, I look at the general information about the letter to Philemon. The second part will deal with some theological perspective of Paul's teaching present in this letter. Letter to Philemon is one of Paul's authentic letters from the category of prison letters. There is still an ongoing debate among the biblical scholars about the place and consequently about the time of its origin. The traditional view is that this letter was written while Paul was in prison in Rome. A Caesarean imprisonment is less probable. Paul requests Philemon to prepare lodging for him in anticipation of his release. This would hardly be the case in Caesarea, however, for Paul appealed to Caesar, prolonging his imprisonment by more than 2 more years. Ephesus seems to me be the most likely location because it is a much shorter distance from Colossae. The great distance between Rome and Colossae, 1,200 miles, is thought to be too great for a runaway slave, Onesimus, to have run to when he fled Colossae. He risked a punishment awaiting those slaves who were caught. The fact that Philemon came from Colossae conveniently fits into the overall framework of the letter. The letter to Philemon bears considerable resemblance to the letter to Colossians. Both letters claim to be written by Paul and Timothy. In both letters, Paul is in prison. 9 of the people mentioned in them are in both letters. I consider the letter to the Colossians as a pseudo-Pauline, written probably by one of Paul's disciples after the letter to Philemon and based on it. It is generally believed that Philemon's home and a house church was situated in Colossae, located approximately 100 miles from Ephesus. The letter to Philemon tells us about Paul's meeting with Onesimus. Due to the lack of detailed information, we can only raise a presumption whether the meeting was first accidental, second, if Onesimus was sent to Paul, or third, if he sought him intentionally. The earliest explanation of the circumstances of the meeting says that Onesimus, who was not a Christian and was a slave in the house of Philemon, caused serious damage to his master. He decided to address the problem by fleeing from his master and seeking out Paul in prison. Paul converted Onesimus to Christianity, and from his own mouth he learned about kindness and faith enjoyed by Philemon in Colossae. As a matter of fact, Paul based his application for the slave Onesimus on Philemon's love and faith. Another explanation says that Onesimus came to Paul purposely with a message or gift from Philemon and from the believers in Colossae, who learned about Paul's imprisonment. The apostle converts him to Christianity and asks Philemon to free him from slavery and thus enable him to serve Paul in proclaiming the gospel. A different explanation said that Onesimus was not a slave who would flee from his master, but a slave who had a disagreement with his master and decided to ask Paul, a family friend, to mediate reconciliation between him and Philemon. Finally, the most recent and questionable position says that Onesimus was not a slave, but Philemon's younger brother. The brothers came to such disagreements that Onesimus begs Paul to mediate reconciliation. The proponents of this opinion base their argument on verse 16, stating that expression in the flesh indicates blood brotherhood. In this sentence, however, the expression in the flesh and in the Lord point out not a blood kinship, but human and Christian dignity. The most important question is, what makes the letter to Philemon unique, different from other Paul's letters? We have to acknowledge that from a theological point of view, the letter to Philemon surely does not belong to principal teaching of Paul. Perhaps that is why it was often overlooked in the past. Saint Jerome, mentions several persons who talk about this letter in his times. Nihil habere quod edificare nos potest. It has nothing we can build upon. Despite, or precisely because of this, the letter bears several peculiarities I want to talk about. Well, I have to go back. First peculiarity, or first example. Oops, does it work? Last view. Yep. First thing is, it is perfect example to understand the structure of Paul's letters. This is something very useful for students. Paul's personal presence was clearly the most preferable contact with Christians to whom he had preached. When the apostle could not visit the church himself, he would commission an emissary to represent himself to the members of their congregation. A less desirable but still very effective way to present himself was through his letters. So far as we know, Paul was the first Christian missionary to have written letters, and his letters represent the oldest literature in the New Testament. Biblical scholars have traditionally interpreted Paul's letters as Greco-Roman letters, which Paul adapted and altered for Christian purposes. Because of its brevity and clarity, the letter to Philemon is a very good tool to understand the structure of all other Paul's letters. The basic form of his letters contain a classic threefold division: an introductory section, the main body of the letter, and a concluding section. I grew up in communism, where the irony was this: oftentimes, the only way to convey the ideas of freedom was, at the same time, to remain invisible to the omnipresent political system. I find Paul to be delightfully ironic, and I like it. Irony is a rhetorical art of saying one thing while meaning another. Serves Paul to prick skillfully at Philemon's conscience. Irony often made use of understatement and overstatement. There is always the chance that the irony will be misunderstood, because irony makes its point only indirectly. Nevertheless, if the irony is employed in a competent way, it can diffuse situations that might otherwise cause conflict. This is exactly the case of Paul and his very good friend Philemon. Let me give you some examples from our text. In verse 4 and 5, Paul praises Philemon's love and faith for all the saints. The word saint is used here to refer to Christian community in Philemon's house. How is it then possible that a slave would run away from his loving master? Second, in verse 8 and 9, Paul puts aside his apostolic authority. He doesn't say, I, Paul, apostle, commend you. And he speaks rather as an old man and prisoner. Who would refuse to fulfill a wish of old, suffering men? Third, in Rome, slaves had a single name given to them by their master, often coming from mythology, referring to their country of origin, or referring to a personal characteristic. The slave's name, like everything else, was completely at the discretion of his or her owner. The literal meaning of the slave's name, Onesimus, is profitable, helpful. But in verse 11, Paul surprisingly calls Onesimus before his conversion useless, and only after the conversion useful. Paul offers to his friend a different angle of view of usefulness. The knowledge of the biblical Greek plays a useful role too. Conversion in Paul's prison resulted in Onesimus' personal transformation. Once he was useless, in Greek, achrestos, but now he is useful, euchrestos. And of course, the common root of these two words, Christos, sound the same as the word for Christ. Christos, Christos. In verse 18, we hear Paul's promise. If he, it means Onesimus, has done you, Philemon, any injustice, or owes you anything, charge it to me. But immediately in following verse 19, we read, you owe your very self to me. In other words, Philemon, don't even try to ask for any restitution. Finally, in verse 21, it looks like Paul left the decision about Onesimus' destiny entirely into hands of Philemon. Forget it. There is another thing in verse 22. At the same time, prepare a guest room for me, for I hope to be granted to you through your prayers. In other words, Philemon, make a good decision before I come to visit you at your house. The most striking feature of the letter is not irony. Irony is the fascinating world of connections and relations among the people mentioned in the letter. It turned the letter into a school of dynamics of culture and interpersonal relationships, which is often lacking nowadays. Our faith should be a place where our vertical relationship with God is confirmed by our love and justice within our horizontal relationships with other people. The letter is composed of two focal points associated with two persons and their authority. The first is Colossae, where the local Christian community gathers in the house of a wealthy believer, Philemon. Roman domus, house, was not just a place for living, but it was also a social, cultural, and economic environment where different levels of relationships were pursued: education of children, meeting with friends and clients, receptions, etc. Paterfamilias, the father who had power over every member of the house, stood at the head of the family. As a rule, it was the oldest male family member. His power had several forms: paternal power over children, power over his wife, power over freed people who were personally dependent on the head of the family, and power over his own slaves. Paul appeals to Philemon, who had the authority and status of Paterfamilias. The second focus is Paul's imprisonment. However, it is a big surprise that even Paul, in his relationship to Onesimus, puts himself in the position of Paterfamilias. Namely, in verse 10 he says, "I'm appealing to you for my child, Onesimus, whose father I have become during my imprisonment." Therefore, the situation regarding Onesimus changes dramatically when Paul assumes status of Paterfamilias and identifies Onesimus as his child whom he begat. Yet, this fact changes the relationship of Paul to Philemon. He is no longer only his friend, but also Paterfamilias, who has the right to keep Onesimus. The dynamics of relationships and the plot moves on thanks to Onesimus, who comes to Paul from Philemon and eventually goes back from Paul to Philemon. Therefore, there is a triad of relations that are transformed by their common relationship to God, whom in the letter Paul addresses as our Father, verse 3. Paul understands that he is not physical father of the slave, just as Philemon is not. God is their heavenly Father and the creator of all earthly fatherhood. The Christian household can be symbolized as God's household. In God's household system, God is the patron and believers are the clients. God is the Paterfamilias, takes care of all members of his house. In superscripts, Timothy is referred to as a co-sender, whom Paul calls brother. Paul's insistence on Philemon to accept Onesimus as a beloved brother is a result of the deepening of God's fatherhood. On the basis of it, we are the children of God, which thus means that we are brothers and sisters to each other. Paul demonstrates this fact, referring his own attitude to Timothy. Another relationship is expressed by the attitude toward Jesus Christ. Paul speaks of Jesus Christ as Lord in two places, verse 3 and 5. Jesus is not just Paul's Lord, but also the Lord of Philemon. In God's household system, everyone is a slave of Jesus Christ. In verse 9, Paul refers to himself as to presbytes. Most biblical translations of this Greek word are understood as an elderly man. Yep, one more. Is this? Or I'm going backward. Yeah, here we are. Since there are variations in ancient manuscripts, some biblical scholars suggest the meaning of this word as presbytes, envoy. The alternative of the meaning presents Paul as not only a prisoner, but now also as the mediator between two people of different social status. These schemes demonstrate that Paul, in the light of his personal experience with the case of Onesimus, reviews his own understanding of faith. Thanks to Onesimus, Paul discovers a new dimension of faith. He realizes that he has the responsibility of a father, but also the proximity of a brother and the service of a slave. He urges Philemon to take a similar consideration into account. Paul himself calls Desmios prisoner in this letter. Paradoxically, the one who is a prisoner pleads for freedom on behalf of a runaway slave. The authoritative title of apostle is absent, not because Paul has suddenly ceased to be an apostle, but because he has no intention of appealing to his apostolic authority. Philemon's decision must be the result of his free choice and spontaneous love. The whole story does not take place in a private sphere, but in the middle of the Christian community. Based on superscript, we learn that the letter is addressed not only to Philemon, but to the entire ecclesial community in Colossae. Development of Christianity is not conceivable without the existence of the local churches, that is, individual houses where Christians met, called Domus Ecclesiae. Philemon's house served as a meeting place of the early church. Within the community, the homeowner could play an important role. He offered the church his house, money, and influence, while he holds a respectable status in the community. In early Christianity, the local churches became a place of prayer, a center of faith, a social environment where men and women, rich and poor, free and slaves, Jews and pagans met. This permitted them to address not only religious issues, but also interpersonal relationships and problems, and abode for gospel preachers. I have been pleased to find these elements also here at St. John's Abbey. Please keep it. This letter demonstrates to us how our faith and our theology must be embodied in our relationships, in our communities, and in the midst of the world. In his request for the fraternal acceptance of Anathemas, Paul challenges to reorganize the interpersonal relations on the basis of a higher principle than the Roman society could offer. On one hand, the letter to Philemon talks about slavery as a contemporary reality. On the other hand, we feel a tension between the gospel and the attitude of the society towards slavery. Perhaps Paul's attitude towards slavery is still disappointing for some present-day readers, as he failed to stand against this social system. Paul did not make a blanket statement that all slaves should be set free. Rather, he presents Christ's message in such a way that people would be impacted in their everyday action by the principles of the gospel. Paul's belief that faith and love substantially affect Christians' life and behavior is evident. Paul's solution is to focus on interiorization, or in other words, Christianization of the existing social structures. Therefore, he appeals for Philemon to accept Onesimus as a beloved brother, not by forcing it, but through love. He thus clarifies to Philemon that slavery is incompatible with the Christian way of life. Conclusion. None of us live a one-way relationship. Inside, we all carry authority, solidarity, and service. It is typical of Paul's conception that he challenges all to overcome tendencies that attempt to control and enslave other people. Christianity brings a perspective that did not conform to the Roman Empire, and it will never conform to any other system that enslaves human freedom, whether by traditional or modern means. The letter to Philemon is a proof that Paul's faith was much more than a mental exercise. It was Paul's imitation of Jesus, shared with others in everyday life. I conclude quoting David Garland from the Theological Seminary, Baylor University in Texas. Some people believe that Christianity only needs to change what we believe. This letter makes it clear that it also needs to change how we treat other people. Thank you for your attention.
I think this is addressed a bit more to Michael, but both of you as experts on Paul. Dunn seems to suggest, and he's not the only one, that somehow people back in Antioch sort of sent a truth squad around after Paul to clean up after him and make sure that he didn't misinform others about the truth of Christ's coming. And is there something to that, do you think? Was he deliberate? Yes, either of you, both of you. It would explain how his furious letter to the Galatians, for example.
Well, there probably could be something to that, and I refer to the Council of Jerusalem that's mentioned actually in the letter to the Galatians as well as in the Acts of the Apostles. This was the meeting where perhaps people are more familiar with the Acts text, where Paul and Peter are up in the north and they start preaching, and they find like the whole thing with Cornelius. Taking on the Christian message, and who's a Roman centurion, and also some of the successes they're having up in Antioch. And they come back down to Jerusalem, and they said, "What is this we hear that you've been talking to Gentiles about Christianity?" And Paul gives this, and Peter gives this great, elaborate description about how the Gentiles we did this, and we saw these great works around them, and why shouldn't they be baptized? And this is a great thing. And said, yeah, you're right. So I'll just make sure that all they have to do is just refrain from blood sacrifice, in literally kind of keeping the covenant of Noah, free not eating the flesh of strangled animals, and free from murder. Okay, just do that, keep sexual morality, and everything else is on the go. So Paul, that's now the way that's interpreted kind of goes both ways, because Paul interprets it very liberally, and the people back in Jerusalem are interpreting it very conservatively, and so that becomes the point of dispute. And it seems that there were always Judaizers on Paul's heels, and so you put the two and two together. If Dunn thinks there was like a truth squad, it seems like a logical conclusion to me. Yeah.
Where was he when he wrote Romans?
It seems to be probably Ephesus, because he was there for quite a long time. That's at least one opinion. But yeah, one opinion.
This is for František. Basically, my question is, can you elaborate on or say more with regard to the interiorization, or in other words, the Christianization of existing social structures? Either I'm having a moment, or something might be getting lost in translation. Because if I can explain, one of our existing social structures today, women are paid about 77 cents for every dollar the man is paid. If I interiorize that, to me what that word interiorize means is that I come to view myself as worth 3/4 what a man is worth. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. If I Christianize that social structure, I'm doing the opposite. I'm changing the structure in the direction of equal children of God kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. So I'm missing something.
Yeah, right. This is not case of Paul, or in my presentation, interiorization and Christianization is the same term. It means to accept Anathemas as slave or as a brother it must be a decision of your heart, of your faith as a Christian. So that I use Christianization and interiorization is a synonym in this context.
So it's interiorizing the faith rather than interiorizing the social structure.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Or to understanding the faith first as my own decision to become Christian, and because I am Christian, I accept you as a brother, and not because it is something outside given to me, or given to me as an order, but something I assume as a principle of my life. I decided for.
At morning prayer this morning, we had a reading from Romans where Paul was pretty adamant that you had to accept every civil authority as from God. Would either of you like to comment on that in this connection?
Yeah, that gets pretty, it's one of those great contradictions, I think, that we sometimes hear in the Pauline correspondence. It seems to me that Paul talks a lot, okay? And a lot of the times what you have to do is keep it in its context. I think sometimes we have a tendency, particularly maybe I think it's because it comes with Scripture, that every single piece is weighed or is interpreted through the same lens, and it's not necessarily so. When Paul's talking in chapters 12, and I'm not fit for, I don't have the text in front of me exactly what the whole thing is about there, but he's probably addressing a specific situation or has a certain thing in mind that needs addressing, like about the civil structures and somehow keeping the idea that looking for the goodness in the society that already exists, that trying to make the point that the world he lives in, the world he travels in, the security that Rome offered, that he can travel the roads and all that, was something good. On the other hand, if you start throwing in all the other things the Romans are doing, Paul's going to have a different critique about obeying. And I'm not always sure, at least that he's always conversant between those two pieces, depending on what he's writing and all that. That's about the best I can do in trying to think about the whole thing.
Just short observation. It's important to remember Paul was also Roman citizen. It means he profits from being Roman citizen. So he was not really opposite against the Roman system. He enjoyed many privileges. And also, as Michael said, it's important to read these lines in connection with different letters. For example, in letters of Ephesians or Colossians or whatever it is, there are texts encouraging slaves to obey lords and masters. In pastoral epistles, I'm analyzing, there are encouragement toward the slaves to obey Christians, masters and owners. So not only those who are pagan masters, but also your Christians. Be patient and be obedient to your Christian owners. So it's always a different level in which we are reading these texts and different social or a situation of author is describing or expressing himself.
If I'm not mistaken, I think the institution of slavery varied a bit during these times as well. So I think we have to be careful to not equate this slavery with chattel slavery as was known in this country or with apartheid as was known in South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, in the Roman system, one of the ways that even kept down slave revolts, and it seems to be pretty universal, but not absolutely universal, is that slaves, that masters would free slaves when they got to a certain age and give them a certain amount of property or a certain amount of funds, that they would become freedmen. And then in turn, their children would be free, and they would also become citizens. So it was kind of like, can he get time off for good behavior type thing, And it seemed to perpetuate the system. Not all cases, but that seems to be a pretty prominent one. The other thing too, and going back to where you're talking about chattel slavery, in our own country when we had working with slaves, the letter to Philemon was used by both the abolitionists and the slaveholders to justify their positions. So it kind of goes back to the context then, doesn't it? You kind of take your lens and you're seeing what you're going to focus on. But both sides were using the same letter to one to hold on to slaves and the other one to free them.
And in a similar way, when we find in the Philippians Christological hymn that Christ empties himself out and takes the form of a slave, it's the word doulos, isn't it? It's not the word pais. And so it's without commentary, so it doesn't have that kind of pejorative ring to it.
Well, I didn't say Paul himself uses this term, title for himself. Paul, servant of Jesus Christ, and he uses this slave. We are probably in English you would translate as a slave of Jesus Christ, because in my language, unfortunately, we translate servant, which is less offensive, let's say. But in reality, it's slave. It means Jesus Christ, my patron, and I'm not ashamed to be property of Jesus Christ. I'm something which I can boast in. So usually we have three titles which Paul uses: apostle, prisoner, and slave, as a title of his letters. Yeah. In a very positive way. Yeah, sure.
I notice in the translations, particularly with, I think it's the Revised Standard and the New Revised Standard, that doulos was regularly translated servant, but the Greek for servant would rather be diakonos, and doulos would be the word for slave. So I haven't examined it at length, but I think that is an important distinction.
Sure. It's important distinction when the Acts of Apostles are talking about diakonoi, the deacons. So there is a term diakonos. But when Paul is using in his letters the title, he's not using this. I'm deacon. I'm diakonos. I'm doulos. I'm slave. Right. You are absolutely right. There must be a distinction between slave and servant also in these translations. Yeah.
A question for both of you. Is Paul the founder of Christianity?
Yeah, well, I think, in many ways, I think in terms of, if we see Christianity, the way, what we believe in, I mean, many of the creedal statements is also our vision of Christ and the kind of the cosmic Christ, and the way we, see Christ as universal and going beyond boundaries and beyond nations. I would say, yeah, I mean, in many ways, Christianity as we know it comes from Paul. I mean, of course, we always say, it goes back to Jesus Christ, of course, but Paul is the interpreter, one of the first interpreter, the first theologian coming across that starts to look at it that way. So is he the founder of Christianity? Yes, through Jesus. How's that for a bow out?
So I have a general Paul question, and I'm looking forward to studying more of Paul next year. But in Paul's letters, he writes specifically, to a group of people or to a church. Do we know, or do you have an opinion, if he had a sense that it would be for much larger consumption eventually, beyond just the target group he was writing to in any given letter?
When I mention these houses, domus ecclesiae, it means that, for example, in bigger cities, there's not only one house, but there are several houses where Christians gathered for celebrating, worshiping the Lord. So it's probably sure that these letters were passing from one community to other. And also we have some mention in letter to Colossians. Please read these letters. Be read also in Laodicea and Hierapolis. So this gives us idea or prejudices. Well, probably, yeah. They were written. They were read also in other communities, in broader sense. And it's also the question, but there is a new gate I'm opening right now, a new door, the question of letters, Paul's letter after Paul, I mean, Deutero-Pauline letters. It means they are read or even written in the communities based on Paul's messages or Paul's authority even after his death. Paul's still present in these churches, and which allowed them to create letters in the name of Paul. So also this was, I mentioned these different types of presence of Paul. First was his own personal presence, then missionary or envoy sent to Christian community. And the third presence, it was also still presence, real presence through his letters. When the letter was read, it means Paul says, not like we read something in the letter. No, it's Paul who said to us. So it was still the presence of Paul among the Christian community. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that these letters had a broader community, not just one special community or one special church house.
Well, I'd like to thank each of you for coming this evening, and we'd also like to thank both Michael and František for their insight into the Apostle Paul. Thank you.